let you have the last word in closing. So you'll have plenty of time.
So what I'm going to try to do in this statement is not mention any numbers higher than 3. Okay? Because I mean, we're really not talking so much about numbers as we are about people. And what I want to suggest, we're asking if we're going to shift the cost to the federal government by accepting the subsidies for private option, what guarantees do we have that the federal government is not going to raise taxes to cover the cost? I want to suggest that the federal government has 3 options in this circumstance, all right? And all 3 of these options are pretty terrible. But the federal government, by and large, is only going to choose one, okay? The federal government, if it can't cover the costs, okay, the federal government always has one option, which is that the federal government can always cut spending. It's so incredibly painful for governments to cut spending. They rarely, if ever, do that. It's safe to say that as a practical matter, they never do that. So option 1, cutting spending, almost never going to happen. The second option is the government, if it can't meet its obligations, it might increase taxes. Almost as painful. Unusual. We know it happens, but almost never. Or in any case, too often. Rarely, let's say. Rarely do we see tax increases when the government can't cover its costs. Okay? But the third option, okay, the third option when the government can't cover its costs for a large nationwide program, it's something that the government resorts to all the time. Okay? And I'm going to put aside deficit spending because that's a different thing. When the government can't handle its responsibilities across a nationwide issue, what it routinely does is it tries to devolve the responsibilities to states. Routinely, the government tries to mandate more expenses on the state budgeters. Routinely, the government tries to apply more expenses to the states. Okay? This happens all the time. Again, I don't want to get into numbers. If you look at, so I'll just say generally, if you look at special education funding, okay, the government promised that it was going to bring a whole lot of money to states. Instead, it brought very little, right? Indeed, you can look at what the federal government's signaling, right, in terms of what's called blended rates, in terms of Medicaid reimbursement. It's already signaling that there's a strong possibility that eventually it's not going to come through with its Medicaid promises. So I think policymakers have to be aware of the possibility, right, the federal government's not going to follow through on its promises. I don't want to jump ahead to question 7 very much. So let me just say very briefly, okay, very briefly, there's a suggestion that if we don't like the outcome of the private option, you know, we've been told, well, we can stop, we can get away, we can just read the bill and we can get out. Because it says in the bill, we can leave. I want to suggest to you very briefly, it is far from that simple. And when we get to question 7, I want to suggest to you that there's a reasonable legal argument that, you know, it's kind of like what they used to call you remember these commercials, the Roach Motel? You can check in, but you can't check out, right? There's a possibility that we could have something like that with respect to Medicaid expansion, right? Or like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. We'll get to that with question 7. But the whole prospect of bait and switch, although I don't like to use that word, there's a prospect that this is a one-way street, okay?